Yeah, so tonight we're kicking off the new series, looking at parables and starting with the prodigal son. And I think this is one that probably we're all familiar with. We've all heard, probably many times before. And perhaps we think it's just a story of how someone that's sinful can be redeemed. And while that's certainly true and that's certainly in the parable, I really want to, my sort of goal for tonight, I guess, is to dig a little bit deeper and explore some other themes and some other ideas that we find in it. And so, I'm just going to sort of go through the text. It's in Luke 15, if you want to follow along, and yeah, just point things out as we come to them. Um, so the parable begins with Jesus continues. There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. And I think immediately here we see that this is like a massive insult, right? And especially in the in the culture of the time, like the sort of, ancient Israelite Jewish culture had really strict rules around inheritance, around which son would get what and who deserved what. And maybe in today's society it's not quite such an insult, but at the time it would have basically been equivalent to saying, "Hey, father, I'd rather you were dead. I just want your belongings. I want your stuff." Um, and so perhaps the most interesting part of that is that the father listens, right? Like the father does divide up the estate and give the two sons, well, or this son, what he's asked for. And we might ask, well, isn't the father meant to represent God in this parable, and isn't this sort of irresponsible? Why would the father do this, without even a conversation to ask the son, why do you want this? Try and persuade him otherwise. But I think actually it does show us quite an important picture of how God treats us in some way, right? Because I think really the son here is asking, for freedom from like the father in some sense. He's saying, I want your stuff, I want your blessings, but I don't want relationship with you. I want to be able to manage it myself. And I think so often that's something that we say as well to God, that hey, I want what you can give me, I want what you can do for me, but I'm not actually interested in having that relationship with you. And I think so often when if we do that with God, He will respect that wish, right? And I think that's because He wants us to freely choose to have relationship with Him. He's not going to force us to stay in relationship with Him. So maybe we look at this and think it's irresponsible, but I think it is just a picture of God's heart and how He wants us to have freedom, but to use that freedom to choose to have a relationship with Him. Um, and so the parable continues. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And I think again here we see a picture of perhaps our own flaws when we do act in a way that's not in God's will. I think often we like remove ourselves from those that can help. Maybe we don't speak to friends, maybe we don't go to church because maybe we feel some sense of shame, right? And we feel like worried that they're gonna point out what's wrong. And I think this is a good picture of this. He's not just he takes the belongings nearby. It's no, he's going off to like this distant country. And we also see here this like really just a picture of a really desperate situation, right? Certainly at the time this would have seemed so like incredibly bad to the original listeners, because this in the sort of ancient Israelite culture, the idea of like being in sort of servitude to a foreigner, that would have been seen as bad. Certainly working with pigs, that would have been even worse, because pigs were seen as unclean. And so this idea that he's so desperate that he was willing to eat the food for the pigs would have just been like this shocking image of just like how far this son has like fallen from what is good. Um, and I think in some sense this is sort of showing us the irony, right, of like this son wanted freedom. He wanted to like manage his own stuff, be away from the father, do things in his own strength and his own wisdom. And I think so often when we chase freedom rather than chasing God, that's when we lose our freedom, right? We become slave to these other things. And it's just this really great picture that's in Romans 6 as well. But it says, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness." And yeah, I think this parable, this picture is just a really great image of this, right? Of like when we're chasing doing things in our own wisdom, we become slaves to sin, to other people, to our belongings, and actually, ironically, we then lose our freedom, and it's only by becoming obedient to God, becoming slaves to God, that's how we actually have freedom, right? Um, but then the parable continues. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father." And I think here we kind of see like the first thing that this son does right, and it's this sentence that he sets out and goes back to his father, um, and I think this is kind of good advice for us, right? Like sometimes we're in a bad spot, we're in a bad situation, we feel far from the father, and maybe we're tempted to just like work really hard, we're going to solve it in our own strength, we're going to put in long hours at work, whatever it might be. And actually, I think this is the correct thing to do, right? Is to recognize when you've got yourself into a mess, and return to the father, return to where the good things come from. So yeah, we see here this picture of him recognizing his problem, and for the first time making the correct decision, right? He's like, I'm going to go back and return to my father. Um, and so then the parable continues that while he was a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Then the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. And the first thing I want to sort of highlight here is just like how immediate the father is in going to the son, right? And it's this sentence at the top where it's that while the son was still a long way off, it's like did was the father like watching the road the whole time? Had he maybe had a servant like watching it for him? But this idea that like as soon as the son started making those steps back towards him, like he was so ready to go running towards him. And I think it would have been uh, quite undignified, right? Like the father is probably already got a pretty bad reputation amongst his fellow sort of Jewish culture. The idea that he'd have divided up the estate, given it to his son, that would have been this like embarrassment, the shame, and then the fact that the son has gone off and wasted it all is just this like seems really bad. It's brings a bad name to the family, and then he undignified goes running down a dusty road, and it's like the father doesn't care about that, right? He's not worried about the cost to him or his reputation. He's just ready to receive the son as soon as the son starts to make those steps back to him. And I think sort of continuing in that theme, it's interesting to see this like this sort of speech that the son makes to the father, right? So he says, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Um, but if we compare that back to what we had on the previous slide in verse 18, you can see that there's this extra little bit at the bottom. So he was planning to say, "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." And you can think, oh well, maybe the son's just sort of trying his luck. He's like, "Oh, this is going pretty well. The father's come and greeted me, so I'm just gonna try my luck and see if he'll adopt me back as a son." But actually, I wonder if maybe it's a picture of yeah, again, of this like immediacy. Like, I like to imagine the father, the son starts this speech and says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, and the father's like, shh, don't be silly, bring the robe, bring the calf, bring all these things, and it's just like, yeah, the father isn't going to sort of listen to this whole speech and to this whole like sort of um almost like self-disqualification from the son, right? He thinks he's not worthy, but the father, yeah, in some ways doesn't even make space to hear that, and instead is just so immediate in his redemption. Um, and so I want to explore what it looks like, I guess, to be redeemed in this way, and what it looks like for the father to do this by sort of looking at the different items that the father gives to the son. So we read that he gives the best robe, he puts a ring on his finger, he brings him sandals and the fattened calf, and I think all of these have got some significance and to them. And like, so the robe we start with is sort of a sign of like status and honor and dignity, right? And especially back in those times where all garments would have been handmade. There was none of this, machined, linen like we have today. So like a good clothing would have been, expensive and important. You wouldn't have much, high quality clothing. And so only those in positions of with high status that are worthy of honor would have this good clothing. And so I think, yeah, the best robe is sort of a picture of this. And I think also it's maybe a picture of this idea of like transferring the inheritance from the older to the younger son, right? Because of what it means, because of the fact it's yeah, a thing of status, and also that the older son would have usually had the first pick. And so we see a similar idea in Genesis 27 in the story of Esau and Jacob. So Jacob is the younger son and is sort of conspiring with his mother Rebecca to steal the inheritance from his older brother Esau. And we read that Rebecca took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And so yeah, I think it's this picture that although we might disqualify ourselves from God's love and God's redemption. God's like, no, even though the son has gone off and sinned in this way, he's still worthy to have status, to have dignity. Yeah, and so then the next item that is given is the ring. And I think this is really like a symbol of like authority and trust. And so it's likely that the ring would have had like a family crest engraved on it, or sort of symbols to identify like who this person was. So there's another instance in the Bible where a similar thing happens. So in Genesis 41, so this is just after Joseph has interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and he's being sort of elevated to a place of power. And so we read, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. So interestingly, again, we see this pairing of like the ring and the fine linen, the fine garments, right? But yeah, this signet ring is really this idea of like something that you can like make a stamp with. Perhaps you'd yeah, use it to like almost sign a contract. And so it's almost like the equivalent today of maybe a son comes back to his estranged father, and the father's just like, yeah, don't worry, son, like have my credit card, you can spend money from the family bank account, you can act in the family's name, you have authority, and I trust you with that authority. So yeah, it's just this really interesting picture that the son has been given this. It's not just that he's like, yeah, worthy of respect and honor, but actually like the father trusts him as well. Then the sandals that he's given as well are really a sign of sonship and like relationship, right? And again, with the best robe, sandals would have been a lot more difficult to come by in the time periods, and so they'd have in some ways been too good for the servants, for the slaves. It's likely that most of them would have been barefoot, and so by giving him sandals, he's really once again declaring like, this is my son, right? This is someone who's part of the family. Um, there is perhaps also this link with authority and trust again. So there was this idea of like kinsman redeemers or guardian redeemers in the Old Testament, which was where if a family had fallen on hard times and had to sell their land, or in this story in Ruth, it's because because Naomi's been made into a widow, and so she couldn't keep the land. But this the kinsman redeemer was like a relative who would come and repurchase the land to sort of redeem the family. And in this passage again, we read this idea of like how was this transaction settled? And it's in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So yeah, it's this picture of sonship, but I also wonder if it's a picture of status and trust as well in some sense. And then the final item that we read that he receives is the fattened calf, right? And this obviously brings back all the imagery in the Old Testament of where animals, usually the best animals, would be saved for religious sacrifice, and so that's obviously a picture of Jesus, right, and the cost that's involved in that sacrifice. But it also would again be a symbol of honor and respect. If you had a really important guest visiting, or if there was a big festival or something like that, you'd kill off the best calf, the fattened calf, and use that in that way. And so again, it's showing that the Father's not going to spare any cost here. He's gonna do whatever it takes, right, to restore the Son to where he was. And I think sometimes for us, we struggle to like accept these things, right? I think sometimes we're like that son. We come back to the Father and say, hey, we're not worthy. We don't even deserve to be called your son. And yet, these are all the things that God restores to us when we return to Him. And there's so many pictures of this in the Bible, but like in Adam and Eve, for example, after they ate from the tree, they hid themselves from God, and God had to call out to them, where are you? And it's this picture of shame, and do we sort of disqualify ourselves in some sense? And I know personally sometimes if I know I've done wrong, I then struggle to come to the Bible. I struggle to pray as much, and I think it's this idea of we want to remove ourselves from God in some sense, and yeah, this is just a really great picture of actually like God wants to give us all of these things, right? Status and trust and authority. He wants to restore us to a relationship with Him and sonship, and yeah, He's not going to spare any expense in doing that. So I think this is just a really lovely picture of what it is that the Father does for us. So we come on then to the elder son, and I think perhaps he's sometimes a bit of a forgotten character in this parable. We often focus on the younger son and this story of redemption, and we think, oh, the older son, he was at home, he was doing what was right, he was the the good one. But actually, I think if we read the parable more carefully, it's obvious that he's got his own issues, right? And so let's read the parable. So meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. So just as I guess a little tidbit here, it's interesting that he doesn't go to the father to ask what's going on, right? He speaks to a servant, and I think that's maybe something that we do. Do we, if something's gone wrong in our lives, or if we're not sure what's happening, do we go straight to the Father, or do we go and gossip or talk to people at church, or anything like yeah, do we turn to other people? And actually, I think perhaps our first port of call should be, hey, go to the Father, because we Jesus died so that we can have a direct relationship with Him, right? We don't need to go through a priest or anything. So yeah, that's just an interesting tidbit, I think. But then, so the response continues. So the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, came home, you killed the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So I think the first thing that I want to point out here is that just like the younger son, the older son doesn't understand freedom, right? so he's stayed with the father all these years. But what's he been doing? He's been slaving. He's been obeying orders. He's been and he's become bitter because of that, right? Um, yeah, I think it's interesting that in some sense the younger son was wanted to take all his belongings and get away from the father, live his own way, and have freedom. Um, and so he didn't, and he should have stayed with God, to stayed with the father, to have freedom. And in the same way that the older son doesn't understand freedom either, right? He's like, oh, I'm going to stay with the father and slave for him. And he doesn't get the father's heart, and so the father replies that you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. And yeah, God doesn't call us. Um, he doesn't want us to become bitter and think we're slaving for him, right? He wants us to have a relationship with him. And so while the son is there physically with the father, is he does he have that relationship with the father? Yeah, so it's interesting to see to see the father's response. Um, it's also, I think, interesting that the older son doesn't refer to his brother as a brother, right? He's like, when he talks, he says, this son of yours, and when the father responds, he says, this brother of yours. And so it's almost like this like accusation to the father, right? It's like, oh, it was this son of yours. He's nothing to do with me. He's not my brother. He's like disowned him. Whereas to the father, it's still that family relationship, right? He talks to him as this brother of yours. um and I think maybe there's something of a warning in there for us, that are we sometimes skeptical of people that have been redeemed, right? Are there people that we look at and think, oh, they've had such a broken life, they can't possibly be loved, they're not worthy of God's presence. um just as this older son is thinking that his brother is no longer part of the family and is no longer worthy of that. And maybe even sometimes we sort of accuse God. It sounds like in some way this is an accusation that he's saying, this son who's done all this, he's squandered your property and all this. And it's like a rebuke almost to the father, like, how could you love this son and now. And yeah, I think maybe sometimes similarly, are we sort of skeptical of God's judgment? Do we think we need to protect God from we see what's really going on with this sinner? Why doesn't God see it? And it's like, I think God's capable of looking after himself, and I think and yeah, and he sees our hearts so much more than we see each other's hearts. And so yeah, maybe it's this warning against sort of being skeptical of God's judgment as well. And yeah, we see a picture of this in Acts, when Saul is on the road to Damascus. He's been persecuting and killing Christians, and then he would sees this vision and is converted to to Christianity, and becomes Paul, who today we all see as this religious figure who's written all these books in the Bible. But the response of the believers to him was skepticism at the time, right? In fact, they plotted to kill him because they didn't believe that his heart had actually been transformed. And so yeah, maybe sometimes we do the same, where a sinner, well, I mean, we're all sinners, but someone that we think is unworthy, are we too skeptical of them? And do we need to welcome them back into the family, just as God welcomed back this son? Um, and yeah, interestingly, that's the end of the story. We heard the son, the older son, speak to the father. We heard the father's response to the son, and then it cuts off. We don't know how the older son responded to that. Did he say to the father, "Oh, good point, Dad. I'm going to come in and join the party"? Maybe he did, but it's left to our imagination. And maybe he carried on being angry. Maybe he continued to refuse to come in. And I think it's kind of interesting because Jesus has like set up this whole chapter. So in Luke 15, we've got multiple parables. So we've got the parable of the lost sheep. So it's the shepherd had 100 sheep, one's gone astray, and he went and found it. And when he did, there was lots of rejoicing. There's a story of a woman who had 10 coins. She's lost one of the coins, and so she diligently searches the house, and she finds it. And again, there's joy and celebration. And then obviously this younger son that we've just read about, there's when he's found, when he's restored, there's joy and there's celebration. But the older son, we don't know. We don't know what his response is. And I wonder if if it's something of a warning, right? This picture of being nearby to God but not understanding his heart. And there's this really challenging passage in Matthew 7, which says, so this is Jesus speaking. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. And yeah, I think this is a really challenging passage. It's certainly one I've struggled with in the past, because I think in some sense it's like calling into question our salvation, right? It's like this idea of do we really know uh, do we really know Jesus? And I think this passage, it's not meant to condemn us, and I think the context is really important. So just before this passage, Jesus is talking about false prophets, and so some people interpret this as being a warning against false prophets if they're using Jesus's name but twisting his words for their own gain. Then they're it's not because they believe in Jesus that they're doing this. It's just they want fame or material possession. So maybe it's talking about that. Some people interpret this passage as well as being a warning against work based salvation. So this idea, they prophesied, they drive out demons, they did all this stuff, but they didn't actually know Jesus. And so I think the context is important. I think we can know, we can be rest assured that we know when we're saved, when we trust in Jesus. But yeah, I do wonder if it's meant as a bit of a conviction, especially in light of this passage and this idea of like the older son who was with the father the whole time, but actually he just completely didn't understand the father's heart. And yeah, just going back to that point that the older son is the only thing that we don't know whether he was saved, right? Like the coin was saved, the sheep was saved, the younger son was saved. Was the older son saved? We don't know, and maybe it is this thing that in some sense it's almost the hardest person to be saved is the person who thinks they've got it all together, right? They think they're near the father, they're right, they're doing good, but actually they don't understand the father's heart. And so maybe it's something that we should ponder on ourselves is do we just sort of go through the Christian motions, think we're in church, and so we're all good, but actually maybe we don't understand the father's heart, we don't know what it is that he's doing. So yeah, I think this is a challenging passage, but I think perhaps also one to sort of ponder on and think about as to whether we really have that relationship with God, or if we're just nearby, the church and nearby people, with the relationship. Do we have the relationship ourselves? So we're going to move into a time of discussion. I think there's a few things that we can talk about. The first is just if anything has stood out to you, if you've seen anything in a new way that perhaps you've heard the parable before, but something new stood out to you. And then also this idea of all the different things that God's gives us when we're redeemed. So dignity, honor, trust, authority, relationship, the cost. Do we struggle to accept any of those things? Due to shame, due to sort of ruling ourselves out. And then finally maybe we can touch on that idea of how do we know that we're truly saved? We're not just sort of nearby but not understanding God's heart. So yeah, we're gonna move into a time of discussion.